You've probably from time to time seen those church signs that have all kinds of maxims and sayings out there on them. One of my favorites is one I saw quite a number of years ago when I was driving by a church up in the Sacramento area. And it read, "Love your enemies. It messes with their minds." Now, I doubt that Jesus would put it quite that way. And Jesus would likely not approve of the implied motive there. But at least the first part of that counsel comes directly from Jesus. It's at the heart of our lectionary text for this morning from the 6th chapter of Luke's Gospel, the so-called Sermon on the Plain. And as Laura indicated, we're just picking up from where we left off last week in that sermon. In Matthew's version, which is in chapters 5 to 7 of Matthew, this sermon is called the Sermon on the Mount. And you're probably more familiar with that than you are with Luke's version. In Matthew, Jesus delivers these words, probably not from an actual high mountain, but from a high place. In Luke, he comes down to deliver them on a flat spot, on a plain. And so that's why it's called the Sermon on the Plain. In either context, in Matthew or Luke, it's one of the most important sections in our whole Bible for understanding what it means to be a Christian, what it means to live as a disciple of Jesus Christ. And last week we looked at the opening part of that sermon, specifically the first of the blesseds. Blessed are you who are poor. And those of you who were here last week may recall that I suggested that we look at that word poor in the context of the original Greek in which Luke wrote. And note that the word that he uses for poor doesn't mean just not having money. It means being needy and open to help in any form. And I suggested that we need to be very intentional about putting Jesus' words into practice by seeking and receiving that help. Well, I think there's a sense in which today's scripture, which comes next in the lectionary, back to back in the lectionary, back to back in our thinking about them in our worship here, this next part looks at the other side of that equation and focuses not so much on what it means for us to be on the receiving end of love and help, but how we can and should be givers. Now, as it turns out, when we look closely at what Luke is saying here, it's not quite as simple as we might want to think. In fact, if we take it seriously, this passage can be a disturbing one. It's likely to make us uncomfortable. Because in this context, Jesus is not speaking just about giving in general, or about giving back to those who are being kind and generous toward us, but about giving unconditionally. Giving even to people we might think are undeserving of our kindness. So when it comes to this particular bit of instruction, we might be inclined to rationalize it away, to dismiss it as being simply irrelevant and impractical in the kind of world in which we live. But listen again to what Jesus says. I tell you who hear me, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Now, I think there are two ways, two contexts, if you will, in which we might apply this teaching. Both are appropriate and important. One is personally or individually, and the other is collectively. On a personal one-to-one level, I suppose there might be people out there who hate me, who consider me to be their enemy, and toward whom I might return that sentiment. It might be because of something I've said, something I've done, or even more likely just because of who I am and what I represent. But for whatever reason, they choose to be antagonistic or adversarial. Unfortunately, I've had people in congregations who seem to take that approach toward me. So I can apply this passage to any or all of them. I can apply this teaching to my attitudes and my actions with regard to those people. If you think about it, I'm guessing you know people who in the same sense hate you, or at least act that way. And you can do the same with them. You can take Jesus' words to heart and refuse to reciprocate hatred for hatred. You can love those people. You can pray for those people. You can do good to them and for them. And you should. So that's the personal one-to-one application. But I suspect that what Jesus had in mind is much more than just our individual relationships. He was also referring to relationships between groups of people. He was thinking about the enemy-like hateful divisions which exist today across lines of race and class and culture and nation. Maybe he was even anticipating our political divisions. And he was saying there too, don't get caught up in the ways of the world. Don't yield to hatred, prejudice, or animosity, or distrust, or alienation. Instead, build bridges. Cultivate love and caring. Do good. And if we think of it that way, it means that these verses and this teaching are far from being obsolete and outdated. Instead, they are particularly appropriate for our modern world, for what has become very much a global village in which people are increasingly in close proximity to one another, but also in which we seem to be more divided and in conflict with one another. They're perfect for our contemporary context in which we have so many different lifestyles and religions and cultures and nationalities and political divisions. And all of that in what seems to be, in effect, a smaller living space. What Jesus is saying to us here is that seeing other people or other groups of people as enemies is fundamentally wrong. Looking with distrust and dislike and suspicion upon those who are different from us, different in any regard, is immoral. Being divided and alienated from people who are truly our brothers and sisters is a sin. That's a message which Jesus preached and demonstrated in a number of contexts. One of the more familiar of that context for you might be the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke's Gospel. You'll remember that there was a story about a man who was traveling down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was beaten by robbers and left for dead. A couple of religious leaders saw him lying there and just passed by on the other side of the road without doing anything to help. It was the Samaritan who stopped to bandage the man's wounds, to take him to an end and get him the help he needed. And we miss the point of that story unless we realize that Jews, the people to whom Jesus was speaking, considered the Samaritans to be their enemies. All you had to do was to be born a Samaritan, and the Jews hated you. But in this parable, Jesus has a Samaritan be the one to lovingly and compassionately help the Jew. So Jesus, himself a Jew, is saying to his fellow Jews, Samaritans are not your enemies. They may be racially and culturally and in a number of other ways different from you, but they are not your enemies. They're your neighbors. Treat them that way. Expect them to treat you that way. Love those whom you consider to be your enemy. Do good to those who think you are their enemy. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. And then this, bless those who curse you and pray for those who mistreat you. And you can think about that quite literally. In our conflicted and antagonistic society, vocal cursing has been all too frequently a way of communicating anger or displeasure. I don't know about you, but it disturbs me when I hear vocal cursing, even if it's not directed toward me. I think it's a form of verbal violence. And it seems to be becoming more prevalent. Actually, though, there may be a more common curse that's not verbal at all. It's a certain nonverbal hand gesture used most frequently by offending motorists. And I can tell you, I've been saluted more than once. And as far as I know, it was no fault of my own. I was just driving along. But now I hear Jesus say to me, bless those who curse you. So I'm trying to think of some gesture that would communicate blessing. And I suppose I could blow him a kiss. But that might be misinterpreted. But here's the thing. What I can do is to follow the other part of Jesus' instruction here. I can pray for those who mistreat me, or who I think have mistreated me, or who I see mistreating others. I can do that, and I should do that. And then after these opening words in verse 26, or 28, the rest of the instructions in this passage have to do with specific instances, with concrete ways in which we're to respond to violence, or to abuse, or to being struck, or to being stolen from. There's even a word here about beggars, those who harass you with a request for help. So what we have here in this section is primarily counsel for victims. Jesus is speaking here to those of us who live and interact with other people who in one way or another seem to be doing us harm. People who we think have wronged us. And what does Jesus tell us to do? This may surprise you a bit. But I think what Jesus says here is, don't settle for being a victim. Fight back. Be proactive. Respond. Take matters into your own hands. The problem, though, is that when you and I think about response, we tend to think about a suitable retort. We don't think the way Jesus does. We think in terms of vindictiveness. We think of hurting back. We think of coming up with an even better curse. And that's not what Jesus is talking about. That's not fighting back against evil. That's surrendering to it. That's giving up and giving in. That's becoming like those who have hurt us. That's joining them. St. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, is even more direct about our need to fight back. When it comes to the evil, the violence, the hatred, the animosity in this world, he says, we're not fighting against human beings, but against wicked spiritual forces. In other words, we're in a war here, folks. Same war that Jesus fought. The war to free the world from its bondage to evil. And as Christians, we've enlisted on Jesus' side in that war. So when we join the church, it's like joining an army. An army that fights the evils of this world. The things that destroy the goodness of human life. The point of this passage is to tell us that in this battle, you don't fight evil with evil. You fight evil with good. The fact is that we do live in what seems to be an increasingly antagonistic, conflict-oriented world. So what can we do about it? How can we apply Jesus' love your enemies teaching in a way that can make a positive difference? Well, let's think about that idea, not just in terms of interacting with those we might perceive as enemies, but in a broader sense. Let's think about it in terms of our relationships and our human interactions in general. In other words, what can we do, what can you and I do in concrete, practical, day-by-day terms to make this a more loving world? Well, I have one suggestion or a set of suggestions for you. And it goes back to a movement that started in 1982 when Ann Herbert, who was a writer for the Berkeley-based Whole Earth Review, took an idea and started what became an international movement using the phrase, practice random acts of kindness and senseless acts of beauty. You may have heard that phrase. You may have seen it on a poster or on a bumper sticker. Well, that phrase, that idea, gave birth to a Random Acts of Kindness Foundation. And an internationally based organization called World Kindness Movement. They have an extensive website you can go to. You can find all kinds of ideas and resources there. Random Acts of Kindness has been abbreviated RAK. And participants are sometimes referred to as Racksters or Racktivists. One of the first reports of someone putting that practice, or that slogan into practice, was a woman who saw those words on a friend's refrigerator. The next day, she was driving across the San Francisco Bay Bridge. She gave the man in the toll booth 7 commuter tickets and said, "This is for me and the next 6 people behind me." And one after another, those 6 drivers came up to the toll booth and were told, "It's been taken care of. Have a nice day." Well, I imagine they did. And I wouldn't be surprised if it rubbed off so that the people those people lived with and worked with had a nicer day as well. Because they see that's the way kindness works. It's contagious. Another woman saw those words, practice random kindness and senseless acts of beauty, written on a wall. She wrote the phrase down, gave it to her husband, who was a 7th grade school teacher. He put it on a poster in his classroom, and his students agreed to put it into practice as a sort of class project. One of the parents then notified a local newspaper reporter who did a story on it. You see, that's the way this idea, and the phrase, and the practice has been spreading for the past 4 decades. Now that Random Acts of Kindness Foundation is producing all kinds of resources to help people who want to make spreading kindness a way of life. You can go to their website and find things like a list of 100 random acts of kindness ideas. And one of the things that they've done is to make every February 17th Random Acts of Kindness Day. If you didn't already know about it, you missed it this year. You see it up on the screen there. You missed it this year because it was last Thursday. But it's not too late to get in on it. Because the idea behind Random Acts of Kindness Day, the goal behind it, is to make spreading kindness a daily practice all year long. And so, as of Thursday, the theme that they have launched for this year is Make Kindness the Norm. And they've come up with a long list of suggestions for how we might do that. Things like this. Compliment someone you don't know. Someone you don't know. And do it with sincerity. Write a letter and mail it to someone who isn't expecting it. Let others go ahead of you in the grocery line, especially if they have restless young children. Pray for a stranger's meal in a restaurant. And incidentally, Laura and I had that happen for us a couple of months ago. We were down at the, what do you call that, ham place down in Marietta? Honey Baked. Not that that makes a difference. We were down there in Honey Baked. And when we went to pay our bill, they said, it's already been paid for you. And I have not forgotten that. It really impacted me. Do that kind of thing. Send a thank you note to someone who's made a difference in your life, even long ago. And this is something I would have never thought of. Leave a package of disposable diapers or wipes in a family restroom room. Take a bouquet of flowers to a neighbor who lives alone and sit down for a chat. Smile at everyone you see. And the list goes on. Practice random acts of kindness and senseless acts of beauty. One news article about this movement called it Guerrilla Goodness. Not gorilla, the animal in the rainforest, but guerrilla, the French word meaning little war. Having acknowledged that we're engaged as Christians in spiritual warfare, let's think about what it means to be a guerrilla. In warfare, guerrillas are largely those who fight behind the enemy lines, who get behind the battle lines into occupied territories. And they keep perpetuating acts of subversion because they believe these random acts will eventually make a difference. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in any individually measurable way, but cumulatively and ultimately they will make a difference. And I think that's the spirit of what Jesus has in mind for his followers. It's the spirit of this passage. In fact, the whole 6th chapter of Luke's gospel, and I would encourage you to go back and read that over, because I'm only talking about a small part of what Laura read, and it's all really good stuff. But that whole passage can be seen as a manual for Christian guerrilla warfare. It's telling us to be guerrillas of kindness and mercy and goodness in a world that is still in bondage to nastiness and animosity, to anger and alienation, to meanness and violence. It's telling us to fight back the way Jesus did, with random kindness, with love, with what the world would consider to be senseless acts of beauty. Jesus is calling us to show the world a better way, to stop this horrible cycle of divisiveness and enemy making, to move beyond the primitive idea that every insult deserves some sort of gesture in kind, and that every injury demands some similar or worse hurt to the person who's given it. So look for ways to make a positive, loving difference in the world. And if you're abused or offended, treated violently or merely rudely, hated or merely disliked, choose to respond not in kind, but with kindness. Not with hatred, but with love. Not with curses, but with caring. Do it because it's good for you. Do it because it will make a difference in who you are. Do it also because you're enlisted in an army committed to fight against the evils in this world. Do it because although you may not see the results immediately, you're working with God. And because you're working with God, it is going to make a difference in the long run. Will you pray with me? God, it's not a new idea to us that as your disciples, we're called to make a difference in this world. But on a day-to-day basis, it's awfully easy for us to forget or ignore that fact and to just go with the path of least resistance or concede to the ways of the world and become like the world. But we have to acknowledge that even among those who call themselves Christians, those who seriously and intensely and deliberately and consistently put your teachings into practice are in the minority. Help us to embrace that minority until it becomes a bigger and bigger segment of our population. Help us to do what it is that Jesus has instructed us to do, with persistence and with hope and with the conviction that whether it's in the receiving or in the giving, whether it's in the being loved and cared for, or being those who love and care for others, that when we put this teaching that Luke passes on to us from Jesus into practice, we can make a difference. We thank you that you've created us with the ability to respond. to what you have told us. That you have created us with the capacity to love and care, to be both on the receiving and on the giving end. God, we've heard your teaching. Help us to do it. In Jesus' name, amen.